15?
Probably 8.
Okay. Yeah, well, I don't do well with calendar time. All I know is it just keeps racing by. But anyway, yeah, Gary was able to join us from time to time here in Monterey, pre-COVID, pre-Zoom, because of his profession, his work, and traveled through Monterey frequently. But now with Zoom, we have different capabilities. So at any rate, when it was time to think about book reports, I'm not sure how it all came about, but Gary suggested his selection for this evening. And I thought it would be indeed very interesting. And I think that's it. You can introduce it from there, Gary.
Great. Thanks, John. Well, in my late 30s, early 40s, I was searching through a midlife crisis for some interpersonal meaning and came across a book titled Solitude. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that book, Solitude by Anthony Storr. It's a return to self. And in the very last page of the book, the last paragraph, says, "When from our better selves we have too long been parted by the hurrying world, and droop, sick of its business, of its pleasures tired, how gracious, how benign is solitude." That's a quote from the Prelude of Wordsworth, and it's stuck with me ever since. And this book, Solitude, has been my first introduction to Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and others like him. My therapist suggested that I might like to read a new book just out by a poet called Robert Bly, Iron John. It's called a book about men. Her suggestion came as a result of my emotional discussions of inadequacy as a father and a son and husband, provider, protector, and not living up to my golden child expectations. I really love this book. I finished up my first reading of the book during an air flight somewhere in the Midwest, and was sitting in a layover and noticed a gentleman sitting with his back to me in the next waiting area over there, and I thought, well, this guy needs to read this book. So I got up and I walked over and I stood in front of him until he looked up from his magazine. I said, "Excuse me, sir, you need to read this book." And then I turned and walked away. And I don't do things like that, but I am quite the wacko. At any rate, Robert Bly, on his book tour, came to Cal State University, Fresno in 91 or 92. He spent most of his time reading his poetry. I was hoping a little more of the self-help stuff from his book, but I was really surprised that the whole crowd, the auditorium, was just packed with people, and they were just awestruck with the poetry of Robert Bly. Poetry's kind of taken it's an acquired taste for me over the years, but rereading this book this past month, I've come to appreciate Robert Bly more as a poet than a men's movement organizer. When I volunteered for this book discussion for tonight, I hadn't even realized that Robert Bly passed away just this last December 2021. And if you kind of bear with me here, I've got a video, and I'm going to kind of blow through some snippets for about 15 minutes here, and it's a documentary on Bly in his late years. Let's see. You said check this box and check this box, and then where did it go?
And then you have to hit share at the bottom right-hand corner.
Bottom right-hand corner, hit share. Okay.
There you go.
Yep. And then I've got to get this one down. Where did my Robert Bly thing go?
I can see something that says Robert Bly on it.
Yeah, that's the I'm going to have to restart this one. Yeah, here it is.
Want to maximize it for us so we get the whole.
See it?
Funding for this program is provided in part by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and the Friends of Minnesota Experience.
Who's out there at 6 a.m.? The man throwing newspapers onto the porch, and the roaming souls suddenly drawn down into their sleeping bodies.
Robert Bly, he is without question one of the most influential poets in American history.
I have daughters and I have sons. When one of them lays a hand on my shoulder, shining fish turn suddenly into deep sea.
Robert was a father figure to a lot of us.
We really saw him as a threat to the feminist movement.
Perhaps our life is made of struts and paper, like those early Wright brothers planes. Neighbors run along holding the wingtips.
Spiritual reverence and political activism operate together in his work.
Is part of what makes him such a contradictory character. No one quite has a handle on Robert.
I do love Yeats's fierceness as he jumped into a poem, and that lovely calm in my father's hands as he buttoned his coat.
Mother Alice took care of him and older brother James, while his father Jacob worked the family farms outside of Madison, Minnesota.
Everyone knew everyone else. There was a certain friendliness, a certain family feeling in that town. I still can close my eyes and see Robert and his brother James standing beside my desk. He looked like the all-American boy of the 40s. I remember there being a number of very fine students, but he was always at the top. He would write beautifully. He had a great command of the English language.
A growing talent nurtured at home by his mother, Alice.
I think that he and my grandmother were very close. You know, he had a sense that she cared for him a lot and protected him in that he was different in the sense that he was always interested in literature.
The young Bly spent his time reading Wordsworth and Longfellow while working his father's crop fields with his brother, James.
I went and enlisted in the Navy the next day.
Bly had to lie about his age. He was only 17 when he graduated high school. After training for 2 years as a naval radar technician, Bly was honorably discharged in 1946, a year after World War II ended.
I was in the Second World War, like a lot of the men in my generation. When we got out of that war, we wanted to do something important or serious.
In 1947, 21-year-old Robert Bly was admitted as a sophomore to Harvard University.
I had thought I might become a doctor, but I didn't know. And then I met some people who had intended to be poets since they were 15 years old, and thought of poetry as a profession.
This group of young poets at Harvard, Frank O'Hara, Kenneth Koch, John Ashbery, they're all there at the same time, and Bly is their equal.
The Minnesota farm boy finally found peers among the prep schoolers in the Ivy League.
I first met Robert Bly in February of 1948. Actually, I call him Bob, and I think I'm the last person allowed to call him Bob. I found out he was a poet, and we started showing each other everything that we wrote and rewriting each other. But there was no humor. There was nothing flamboyant. He was very conservative. He wore a three-piece suit, and he hardly opened his mouth. He would talk like this. He was very solemn.
Jung says it very well. We have a persona first. And a persona is your personality that your parents like in you. It's what your teachers like in you. And this is why in college, we come out of college with this extremely heavy persona. It's a shell around us.
American poetry in the 1950s was extremely rationalistic.
The mood was that poetry was not being heard, and that what poetry was there was excessively intellectual, dominated by the East Coast academics.
An approach Bly had grown dissatisfied with.
What we had to learn is that you forget about the future. You're writing for the people who are alive at your time, and you try to move them as much as you can. But in the universities, they don't think of it that way. They have the insane idea that the poet actually writes for posterity, and they keep urging us to write universal poems and so on.
In 1950, Bly graduated with honors. Harvard offered the promising poet a scholarship to graduate school. He turned it down. In 1956, Bly traveled to Oslo on a Fulbright scholarship to translate Norwegian poetry into English. The trip would hold a crucial discovery.
He discovered in an Oslo library an anthology of poems, and what amazed him is he knew he had never heard of these people, nor had he heard this kind of voice.
What Bly had been seeking since Harvard, he finally found in the imagery of European expressionists and the playfulness of South American surrealists like Pablo Neruda.
I never forget the first line of Neruda that I saw happened to be one something like this: young girls with hands in their heart, dreaming of pirates. And it's lovely, both in the willingness to understand young girls and to talk about that and bringing in pirates. It made a wonderful world. There's wonderful enthusiasm for women and for life and for images and all of those things. That's what I found.
And these people ended up changing his view of the world, changing his voice, and he brought those voices back.
I started a magazine sheerly out of my surprise over what was in Pablo Neruda.
The 50s, a poetry journal of translations, new works, biting satire, and critical essays, was put together at the kitchen table with his wife, Carol, friends Bill and Christina Duffy, and a clear agenda.
They sent their first issue to, like, all the poets around America, caused a tremendous stir.
Kind of Midwestern Thoreau with a dark side.
Think about that, 1962. That's a pivotal year. It's interesting that the book is called Silence in the Snowy Fields, because it comes just before the thaw, and it comes just before the noise of the 60s.
Last week's Indochina casualty figures are out today. 2 more Americans killed in the war, 6 lost, either dead, missing, or captured.
Another 24 were lost, missing, captured, or perhaps dead. 13 were wounded.
Let's count the bodies over again. If we could only make the bodies smaller, the size of skulls, we could make a whole plain white with skulls in the moonlight. If we could only make the bodies smaller, maybe we could get a whole year's kill in front of us on a desk. If we could only make the bodies smaller, we could fit a body into a finger ring for a keepsake forever. I'm not a pacifist. I was in the Second World War, and I thought that war was a just war. Maybe we were wrong, but I still think it was. But I noticed that we didn't count up the bodies of the Germans. We simply said there are heavy casualties in the German front. It's in this war for the first time that we've had this disgusting business of counting up every little small Vietnamese body we can find and counting the heads and arms and adding them up into something. There's clearly something else was going on in this war. Then diving, the green earth swinging, cheeks hanging back, red pins blossoming ahead of us, 20-millimeter cannon fire, rice fields shoot past like telephone poles. The hut roofs loom up huge as landing fields, slugs going in, half the huts on fire, small figures running, palm trees burning, shooting past, up again. Blue sky, cloud mountains. This is what it's like to have a gross national product.
My own sense is that the Vietnam War and the opposition to the war galvanized Bly. And in the light around the body, he began to write these poems against the Vietnam War. Poetry was married to politics for him. And I think it always has.
In the spiritual self, Bly began translating the works of the 14th century Sufi poet Kabir and others in the ecstatic tradition. He also turned to Freud, Carl Jung, and ancient myths and fairy tales.
Once upon a time, there was a king, and the king had a daughter, and he liked his daughter very much. He liked her a lot. Stories always begin once upon a time. They teach you not to think literally. There are ways that have been used to teach children to think metaphorically from the beginning of time.
Robert knew that it's very difficult for modern man to think metaphorically because we're so embedded in our daily concerns. And fairy tales talk about psychological truths that are always true now, not in the past, not in the future. So that's what he wanted us to tap in.
First established in 1975, Bly's annual Great Mother Conference brought together a diverse group of storytellers, psychologists, and mythologists, including Joseph Campbell.
Joe was talking about image. He was talking about symbol. He was talking about this comparative mythology. So, of course, our hearts were open to it.
And you realize the terror as well as the wisdom and charm of this world.
Joe was talking about it being there in many cultures, in many places, among many people. And that's exactly, Robert understood that in terms of poetry.
I was just amazed that Robert actually knew Joseph Campbell, that we were going to actually use myth in events, not just tell a story, but use mythic ideas to bring the myth present.
We were so in tune. There was something very in tune, but we were different disciplines, but very together on the idea of soul and spirit and the idea of the oral tradition. That was the big thing.
Scheduled to do a reading at McAllister. We'd heard a lot of rumors about him trying to get men back to their kind of more macho roots. And so a number of us from the feminist collective said, we need to go and see what this guy is all about. We focused on a few tidbits of his life that he had recently separated from his wife. I remember us thinking, you know, he must have left her in the lurch. You know, we had a whole story about him that may or may not have had anything to do with who he was. And when he got up to read, people stood up and they said, aren't you against a woman's right to an abortion? Aren't you against women's equality? People were very vocal. But he just stood there and he said, no, I'm actually not against any of those things. But then he did launch into a talk about how men had lost a sense of who they were and that he was trying to get men back in touch with their inner selves, which didn't persuade us one bit.
The men's work came out of the Great Mother Conference that Robert and others were involved with, and that Robert noticed after a while that the women were doing rather well. They were, but at the end of those weekends when the men turned up, They were a mess.
In 1982, Bly held the first Conference for Men in Mendocino, California. It would grow into an annual event.
We were getting together all across the country on our own. We didn't know what we were doing, but I mean, we had hints. We were trying to connect and figure this out. So by the time Iron John hit, bam.
4 years ago, a most unlikely book hit the bestseller list and stayed there for more than a year. Iron John, a self-described book about men, made heady use of fairy tale, myth, poetry, and psychology to describe the embattled state of the American male. The book was immediately christened the Bible of what became known as the men's movement, and its author, National Book Award-winning poet Robert Bly, became an overnight celebrity.
The commercial success of Iron John surprised Robert perhaps more than it surprised anybody else.
As soon as something like that gets put out in mainstream media, it's going to get misunderstood, mistaken, and also probably mistreated.
The mass media had a field day with the concept, which even gave birth to a hit sitcom, Home Improvement. Inevitably, a backlash set in, especially from some feminists.
They thought, what? More power for men? I mean, men have been subjugating women since the Neolithic. We can't have any more of that. But of course, that's not what Iron John was about.
Iron John tells the story of an old, wise, wild man of the forest who becomes a mentor to the young boy and leads and guides him through the various stages of masculine psychic development.
Using a Grimm's fairy tale, Bly's book examines what it is to be a man in the modern era.
The psychology that is in Iron John, of which there is plenty, is suffused with the mythological. And when you bring the mythological in, it is as if the elevator goes round to the very, very bottom floor.
Robert realized that some of the problem lay in the lack of ritual, especially initiatory ritual for young men and young people in American society.
Whether you call it fathering or mentoring, it's that vertical plane where wisdom gets transmitted and channeled from one generation to the other.
A lot of the women misunderstood that and were very, hostile to the men getting together at all. But the most hostile were really not the women, but the corporation men, because they've got a lot invested in this driving, power-ridden, let's get all this before we're 30 years old. Don't talk to me about any debt. Don't talk to me about my father. Don't talk to me about the women. Don't talk to me about any of that.
Stay on the New York Times bestseller list for 62 weeks and be translated into over 20 languages. Bly had hit the big time.
Iron John helped characterize him as a self-help author. And I think that did him no favors in the poetry world in America, because a lot of American poets are very sophisticated and do not want their work to be seen as self-help per se.
I remember
I don't mind your saying I will die soon. Even in the sound of the word soon, I hear the word you, which begins every sentence of joy. Ah, you're a thief, the judge said. Let's see your hands. I showed my calloused hands in court. My sentence was 1,000 years of joy.
Are you still there?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. All righty, let's see where I'm at. Any thoughts on Robert Bly? I want to take a couple minutes, and if anyone wants to share any experience they've had with Iron John or or what have you, with Iron John or Robert Bly himself, or poetry. I was struck by the video that the success of Iron John and how famous he became, and the video seemed to imply that real poets don't like fame, I guess. So not sure about that. Anybody want to chime in?
Great video sequence, Gary. Thank you for preparing that. Yeah, very
Thanks.
moving. Yeah, I saw Bly once live here in Monterey. He came to Monterey fairly often for a while, and had events here. And
was he part of the Ferlinghetti crowd?
no, not the Ferlinghetti crowd. No. More toward the Jeffers direction, the nature poetry, in that. But that's speaking very superficially. But we got a glimpse of that in that work. Of course, he also worked closely for quite a while with Marion Woodman, and their videos out. I have the two of them with dance and so forth. And of course, Marion Woodman being a great Jungian, neo-Jungian, post-Jungian, but then Bly and James Hillman and Marion all at Pacifica. Anyway, great to see the video sequence.
Yeah, I think I have found a video with Robert Bly and Marion Woodman, and they were around the table of somebody, but saw one of those. I believe that he also had, if I'm not mistaken, had actually stayed at the tour house with Jeffers at one time. You might know that. I know that he had.
I know that the timing doesn't quite line up. I don't know. I've not heard anything about that, but
I'll have to go back and look at some notes, because yeah, their timing is just a little bit off. Anybody else? Everybody? Go ahead.
I'll just capitalize on his emphasizing the importance of initiation rituals. He and Martine Prechtel were good friends. And if anybody's interested, we did a Martine Prechtel book report a year or two ago. That's on YouTube.
Is everybody familiar with the book? Are they just familiar with the actual story of Iron John, or the actual Grimm's fairy tale that the book is weaved? The whole book is woven around the fairy tale. If you don't mind, I'll just kind of do a quick rendition of that.
Yes, that'd be great.
As best I can remember. It's a metaphor for the challenges of initiating young boys into manhood, and the story comes from Grimm's Brothers, and it's been handed down through the ages, and it's Iron Hans. Once upon a time, a king had a castle near a deep, dark forest, and he kept losing hunters and dogs every time they entered the forest, so he shut it down. And then one day, a hunter was looking for work and came by and offered to figure out what was going on in the forest. And so no sooner had he entered the forest that his dog was pulled down into a big pool of water. The hunter went back to the castle and returned with 3 men with buckets and proceeded to bucket out the water. And at the bottom of the water, they found a rusty-haired wild man who was taken back to the king and was locked in a steel cage, and the key was given to the queen. Well, the next morning, the king's son was playing around with his golden ball, and it rolled into the cage, and he asked Iron John if he could have his ball back, and he said, yeah, all you gotta do is open up the cage. So the boy runs off, comes back the next day, says, can I have my ball back? And Iron John says, yeah, just open the door. Well, the third day that the boy comes back, he says, I don't even know where the key is. Iron John tells him it's under your mother's pillow. Well, the boy got the key, and then as he's opening the the door for the Iron John. He pinches his finger when it's opened up, and so the boy is now afraid that he's going to be punished when his parents come back. So the Iron John puts him on his shoulder and heads off for the forest. And he told the boy that he was going to protect him if he would do as he was told. So the next day they get to a spring, and he says, "Don't let anything fall into that spring." Well, the boy's sitting there, and his fingers kind of hurting, so he dips it into the water, and it turns to gold. Iron John shows back up, and he says, "I see you let something fall into the spring." He says, "Don't let that happen again." So the next day, the boy's sitting there, and he's running his fingers through his hair, and one hair kind of flutters down and goes into the spring, and it turns gold. Iron John comes back and says, "Well, that's two." Says, "Don't let anything happen. Don't let that happen again, or you're going to have to leave." So the next day, the boy's really focused on the spring, and he's looking at himself. He sees this reflection in the water, and he leans way over, and of course his hair kind of tumbles down around his shoulders, and it goes into the water, and it turns gold. Iron John comes back and says, "Well, I'm sorry, but you're going to have to leave. But if you ever need anything, just come to the edge of the forest and call my name. I'll be glad to help." So the boy takes off, goes to the closest town, ends up at the palace, and the cook at the town takes the boy in, gives him a job raking ashes. And then one day the cook asks him to take some food up to the royal table, and so there's a mishap at the royal table. He's still got his hat on. The king doesn't care for that, so he has the cook reassign him to the garden. Well, now in the garden, he's working in the garden, and it's kind of hot in there, and so he takes his hat off. And of course, this golden hair is just by the sun. It just reflects up to the room with the princess, and the princess sees this gold floating around in the room, and she looks out the window and sees that boy down there, and says, "Hey, why don't you bring me up some flowers, a bunch of flowers?" So he goes trotting up to the room, puts his hat on, goes trotting up to the room, goes in, and she tries to take his hat off, and of course he takes off running. She throws 3 coins at him, and the next day he's down in the garden again. Same thing happens. "Hey, boy, why don't you bring me up a bunch of flowers?" So he goes up. Anyway, this happens 3 days. And to no luck, she doesn't get his hat off. And so the boy kind of goes on about his business. Well, the kingdom is at war now. And the king is looking for a few good men to go out and fight the battles. And the boy decides that he wants to help. Says he wants to go with him. The other boys kind of make fun of him. And so they give him a 3-legged horse, or a horse with 3 good legs and 1 hippity-hop leg. And so he goes to Iron John, yells for Iron John, and the force says, "Yeah, I really need a better horse." Iron John gives him a war horse, and in addition to that, gives him a band of warriors to go with him. Boy trots off to war, saves the day, kind of vanquishes the enemy, comes back and returns the horse to Iron John, shows back up at the stable with his hippity hop horse. Nobody knows who this knight, this savior knight was, and they decide between the princess and the king, they decide that, well, maybe we can figure this out. Why don't we have a festival, and the princess is going to throw out golden apples. They're sure that the famous knight would catch this apple. The boy wants to do that. So he goes to Iron John and says, "Hey, I'm going to need a good horse." Iron John gives him red armor and a red horse, and off he goes to the festival. Sure enough, he catches the golden apple, but he runs off, and he doesn't, nobody knows who he is. The next day, he goes to Iron John. They're going to have this festival the second day as well. He goes to Iron John, says, "Hey, I'm going to need another horse." He says, "Here's your white armor and a white horse." And the boy goes to the festival, catches the golden apple, and goes trotting off. Nobody knows who it is. Well, the third day, Iron John gives him a black horse, gives him black armor and a black horse. And the king has said if he catches this apple and runs off again, why don't the rest of you guys chase after him, maybe give him a stick in the leg or something and see if you can figure out who he is. So sure enough, he catches the apple, runs off, and the king's troops run after him, stick him in the leg, jostle him around. His helmet falls off. And of course, everybody can see that he's got this golden head of hair. And he goes back to the turns the horse back into the Iron John, and the princess and the king are kind of still wondering who this savior knight was. Well, the princess is down there talking with the gardener, saying, "Hey, what happened to that boy that was here for the last few days?" He said, "Well, he's in there. He's out there somewhere. He's got 3 golden apples. He's playing with the kids." Well, the princess puts 2 and 2 together, and the boy had to admit that he was the famous knight that saved the kingdom. And so the king was so great, had so much gratitude for this, that he says, anything in my kingdom you can have. And the boy says, "Well, how about your daughter?" And the daughter thought, "Well, this is okay. I like the way he didn't beat around the bush on things." And so they plan a big wedding. And now there's a big wedding, and they're at the wedding ceremony. Oh, the doors open up, and in walks this stately king kind of guy. And he goes up and puts his arm around the boy and says, "Hey, do you recognize me? I'm Iron John. I'm the wild man." He says, I was bewitched by some kind of spell, and you have broken the spell. And so now all of my riches and my kingdom and everything is yours." And so I assume they lived happily ever after from that. But anyway, that's the story of Iron John in a nutshell. Let me think. Yeah, I don't think I missed anything. For Robert Bly, this mythopoetic story holds the ancient secrets for initiation for young men. If you notice, I don't know if you noticed this, but the reoccurring use of 3. There was 3 hunters, three men with buckets, 3 days boys requesting the golden ball back, 3 days of at the spring, calling the Iron John's name 3 times. 3 bouquets for the princess, 3 gold coins, 3 colored armors, 3 horses, 3 days of festival. So there's quite a bit of stuff that we see in mythology all the time. Just focusing on the 3 colors, red, white, and black. Robert Bly concludes that this red, white, and black knight narrative is symbolic of the revolutionary path, a roadmap of masculine evolution. The red knight is the teenager, is your teenage years, young men, very dangerous, out of control, and very much in need of maturing mentoring. Midlife is the white knight desires to save the world. White knight, he's an idealist. And then the black knight is later life and digs deep into shadow work and accepting your wounds. So there's the 3 phases of a man's life. Bly contends that our Western culture has all but abandoned our red knight initiation responsibilities. We have suppressed and silenced our young men from engaging in healthy warrior activities. The lack of mentoring from the older males of the community pushes the teenagers into the white knighthood prematurely. And we have so precious few in our society today that have fitted themselves with the black armor and have done the shadow work to mentor these young men. We got any questions or anything about that? Any other comments? Got this. I want to do one more thing, Lisa. I'm going to share that PowerPoint if it's still up here. Yeah, there it is. Am I still checked in the right boxes? Okay, it's not. See if this comes up.
Yep.
You're good.
Okay, good. All right, anyway, so I just have a couple slides that I wanted to kind of flip through, some slides from previous stuff. There's Iron John. Let me do this. Click it like it's a presentation. Does that work? Okay. Okay, Robert Bly and a book about men. And there is, by the way, a picture. You did see a picture of Robert Bly, and he just passed away. If you remember when I was doing the book review for Jordan Peterson, one of his chapters, I think chapter 2 was on Rebus's woodcuts, and it had the, we're speaking of the golden ball or the winged sphere. The bottom part of this kind of depicts that golden ball winged sphere, and then the danger dragon of things. And of course, there's a whole discussion on this, and I've kind of forgotten all the symbolism that's here. This here, if you remember, it was who is that?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter, and it's got that winged spear, and it's the snitch, and it's the stuff that you see in a lot of the fairy tales. And in this particular one, it was the young man was playing with a golden ball, and Goldhead took a big part of that. Okay, let me get to this. Okay, who is that wild man? Who is the wild man? Where did he come from? And how does he get in the bottom of the pond? Well, Robert Bly, in the epilogue in the book is here, says that he provides a compelling account tracking mankind through his hunting, gathering, and agricultural periods. Tales of the Lord of Animals show up as early as 14,000 years ago. There's a book John Pfeiffer wrote, The Creative Explosion, reports that the famous paintings in the famous cave paintings that we've seen are not just for fertility and for hunting rituals, but chambers for initiation of young men as well. This master of the hunt can be traced back through the gods of almost all religions of the world. We first see the wild man through the Sumerian epic Gilgamesh, about 700 BC, in the character of Enkidu. I think Sandra did a presentation on Sumerian stuff and spoke a lot about Enkidu at one time. But Enkidu was a hairy sort. At some time during the Old Testament agricultural world, the hairy man was exiled. A famous alchemical woodcut that you see here in 1566 depicts a Flemish pageant where the wild man is being escorted out of town. There's 3 actors that confront the wild man. He's got confront the wild man. The representative of the Holy Church, Holy Roman Church on the left, shows him with a globe with a cross atop to remind him that his time is over. You may have seen that. I don't know if you noticed when Queen Elizabeth was just passed away, and they had a globe with a cross on top of it, and the crown, and then the staff. Then there's a military man, which is aiming his crossbow at him. And then there's the nun, I believe that's a nun, holds out a golden ring of sexual union. The pageant then runs him out of town and throws him into a lake or a pond, and he is ritually executed. Medieval culture then took a turn for the worst. The longing to repress the libido declared that women were evil, and it was Paul that laid the groundwork for the hatred of sexuality, and women's sexuality suffered tremendously. Young men concluded quickly that their sexual instincts was troublesome. Mary Louise von Franz lectures on the wild man, tells of dreams of both men and women that describe figures covered with hair, and she believes that the psyche is asking for a new hairy religious figure in touch with God and sexuality, with spirit and earth. Let me see if I've got anything else here. That's one of the cave paintings that is a initiation of a young man, I believe. This is one of my favorite, I forget what this is called, but it's one of my favorite things, looking out into the unknown very cautiously. And this is a wild man looking deep into your shadow and looking on the inside of things.
It's a Blake, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about, for how long did Bly organize and have these male retreats in which there was ritual and bonding? For what age period did that happen, or the years? Because our society in Western, well, of course, the US, made so many cultural changes. For how long did he do that? And then did he go back to his poetry and more lyrical writing?
You know, I don't
organized male trips or retreats.
And I don't know the answer to that. John might know, or anybody else, but it seems that in the video, that was a video that was of just, it was just the year before he passed away, which was last year, 2021. So that was up to 2020. I don't know that I recall them saying how long he was doing the men's retreat.
Okay.
Well, I think Michael Meade kind of took the mantle and, kept doing it, even if, Bly kind of faded out. I think Michael Meade took it up.
Where does Hillman fit in with that then? Because he took up that whole way
men's
of
movement thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
And there was a lot of talk of the Great Mother and all of those things in the book itself. They talk of the Great Mother and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, that was an important book by Erich Neumann.
Yes.
I was wondering about Hillman, and he took up the movement, men's movement. I don't know if they overlapped or there was...
Yeah, they worked together. The mythopoetic men's movement was an expression that came about. The mythopoetic men's movement. And there would be sessions, I believe, with Bly and Michael Meade and James Hillman, if I remember correctly. But Hillman was involved, yeah.
And for what time span during the 60s, 70s?
No, this would be more 80s.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe 70s and 80s, not 60s.
We didn't get into a lot of the discussion of all of the things that are kind of going on with young men today. There's quite a bit of things going on with our young men today, and I don't think we're going to solve a lot of those issues. But what did I have here? I had some questions.
Well, I think are you talking about like gang initiations?
Well, yeah, it could be gang initiation, but gangs have kind of taken over and they initiate the boys. But there's so many. There's the lack of the fathers in the family, the nuclear family, the lack of the fathers in there that is having an effect on the young men. Even the lack of we as older grandfathers and how we're supposed to be helping to mentor these young men. I talked about my problems as being, coming through a midlife crisis, but there's a lot of young men that need help and mentoring right now. And I just need to find my way into how to best handle that.
I agree with that, what you're saying about the young men, whether they're in their late teens up until maybe late 20s. It seems like there is, whether or not it has anything to do with the information technology advancing as quickly as it has, but the disintegration of the traditional family mode has changed through the last 20 or 30 years due to many things.
Yeah.
And I think the raising of children and having a family, I think, has been changing. And now, unfortunately, I think a lot of people, I assume they're not getting any guidance at all. And if they do, it's short term. And then it may be another disintegration, whether or not one or both partners of families is able, has the time and the patience or the ability to do some guidance. This is just what I've observed, and I'm not even a parent, but I've noticed there's very little going on now other than work and surviving.
It's hard to say what all the effects are. The absence of the fathers. There's the agricultural age that we've kind of gone through, and then we come to the industrial revolution, where the father is actually gone to work now, and we've lost some things there. There's big discussions on our prison systems today. Why there's so many young men in prison. There's law and order, defund the police. There's toxic masculinity going on, and I assume that there's some positive masculinity. And what's the definition between those two things, and then what are the best ways to approach the boys? There's a lot of things on the web right now about the boy crisis. There's different people. I know that John just sent me a thing with the New York Times on the boy crisis, and there was just, whenever I Googled it, there was just a ton of things. And there's the whole spectrum of, no, we don't have a problem. Yes, we do have a problem. I did catch one thing, that there was an individual that I agreed with, and it was Anthony Bradley. He's a professor of religion at King's College, and he, in his thing that he was talking about, he says boys raised without strong fathers are generally clueless about what it means to be a man, and wreak havoc on society trying to figure out and often leave behind a trail of destruction, pain, and perpetual brokenness. Masculinity is bestowed from one man to another in a large community of men. Without strong communities of morally grounded men, boys will not form for the good, not be formed for the good. Anyway, so I agreed with that.
Yes, I do too.
Anyway,
I was thinking today, I agree with everything you're framing there. We talk a good bit, or it comes up now and then, always, about patriarchy, and there's just the word patriarchy used in various expressions. The problems of the patriarchy, the decline or fall of the patriarchy, and of course we've taken that up here at this table a lot. Discussions of matriarchy and patriarchy, historically, anthropologically, and so forth. But it just in a simple sense, what came to me as I was thinking today was, let's say that patriarchy, just to use that term, we're not going to define it particularly, but I think we can go with it. Patriarchy is in transformation. I think we would probably be able to agree with that whatever it is we mean by patriarchy, that is in transformation. We could even say radical transformation. Then to think of culture, even in my lifetime. I mean, I'm 72 years old, and I can tell my story like you, Gary, of going through various structures and phases in the masculine world. To use that term, masculine world, or the world of masculinity. If patriarchy is radically transforming, then all those structures of what the masculine even means. What does that even mean? And then how is this communicated? And you are very right on. I mean, we can talk about female initiation worthily, but then male initiation is a reality, and it is, and this is what you said that was on your heart, shall we say, when you proposed this evening, was that, you know, this is a serious concern. And it's not a good, 30 years ago when I was teaching girls, all girls in a girls' school, I would say, well, as formidable as the challenges of young women in our time, I felt the challenges of young men were worse because they're not even talked about, really. But that's what you're doing here tonight. You are talking about them. And I think it's very interesting to revisit and consult Iron John.
So one of the things I've noticed about not all young men, but more young men nowadays than when I was younger. So like 20, 30 somethings now versus 20, 30 somethings when I was 20, 30 something, is that they're a lot more balanced in terms of their masculine, feminine nature. Like they're much more comfortable with their feminine side, much more comfortable being real, being authentic, not feeling like they had to put on this show of masculinity. And I mean, that's obviously, you know, not the case for all young men, of course, these days. But I've been kind of buoyed by the shift, and you know, I don't think it's a loss of anything. You know, like you hear you know, the Newt Gingriches and the Alex Joneses talking about, you know, the feminization of men, and you know, they're all turning gay, and that's not the case. You know, that's not what I see. You know, maybe they see it because, you know, they're not like toting guns, but I see it as the masculine becoming more balanced in and of itself.
And I agree with that balance of seeing the younger men becoming more balanced and more fearless and less self-conscious about having to live out the mold of what their fathers maybe have done, of being the prim and the proper. As a general rule, I have noticed, and that is refreshing. But I also think some of the women have changed. They've gone up. We've had all these rights and things, most of us in the Western area. And then I'm kind of seeing a cooling off at some level. And also, I'm also seeing other areas of society within the women, depending upon their socioeconomic and their race, things becoming really gone very well and are progressing. Then now I'm seeing almost like there could be teetering due to our political system and for other reasons. But it is interesting, the younger men they're vastly different from the men that young men and older boys when I was in school.
Yeah,
very much.
iPhone person, did you want to say something? Hello?
Maybe she's.
Wait, are you talking to me?
Yeah, you unmuted yourself, so I thought maybe you wanted to jump into the conversation.
Oh, I didn't even notice I did that. I just moved my phone.
Hey, well, thank you so much for listening and letting me participate in one of these discussions. Appreciate it. And John, I thank you much, and I think the time's yours.
Thank you.
Well, you certainly raise a topic that we should take it up. We should continue this topic, Gary. Again, we haven't done a lot with this realm of masculine psychology. We've done much more with feminine psychology in various ways. I'm also thinking of the work of Robert Moore, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, Gary. Probably. Yes. Robert Moore is a Jungian analyst, no longer living, but his book was King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. I would still recommend that book because he identifies 4 basic archetypal structures: king, warrior, magician, lover. And then he also delineates the inner corollaries that for the outward aspect of all those things has an inner aspect that's queen and female warrior and magician and lover. Anyway, it's some important work. So we should stay tuned. We should stay tuned. Yeah. Okay. Well, we will turn to the second book. I mean, we could have done the whole evening on this, Gary, but
I think so. You know, I kind of got into it. So
yeah. So let's return. Let's revisit this. We've encountered this before in book report evenings. We started out with 4 books, and then we quickly learned that, well, no, let's just do 3 books. And then we learned, well, maybe we better do 2 books. So yes, I will do this. I will also have a screen share in a moment with some text that you can follow along. My presentation will be a bit different in its vibe than Gary's. Just the tone will be somewhat different to present this different book and to get into it. It is a book report I'm giving. I'm not giving a lecture or introducing this book thematically. I'm reporting on the book. And my first motivation here in its way is that for anyone who is interested, please look up the book. I'm not necessarily expecting, however, that many would want to do that in this sense. The book I'm reporting on, Racecraft, is there it is, Racecraft.
Why don't you hold it closer to Athena?
The soul of inequality in American life. There we go. Racecraft, the soul of inequality in American life, by these 2 scholars, highly accomplished scholars who also are sisters, Karen E. Fields and Barbara J. Fields. Again, this is a work of formal scholarship in many respects. It's designed or it's written in a certain way for professional, I don't know how historians, let's see how the authors identify themselves. Distinguished visiting scholar at the Center for African and African American Research at Duke is Karen Fields. Barbara Fields, professor of history at Columbia University. So these are practicing academics. So the book is not really written for, generally speaking, the common reader per se. So they're making carefully reasoned arguments based on scholarship. However, don't let that stop you. And I'll tell you how I got to this book in a moment, and then I have some quotations from the book. I don't know that we'll have much time to discuss them. We just have to deal with that. The topic is so vast. The best I can hope is to give a decent report on the book, and let you, then you can take it from there. I thought that I needed to introduce this in some ways personally, because I mean, that's how I got here, and just give you a quick narrative. And how this book has changed my life. The book has changed my life for the better, I would say. I cannot remember precisely why, but a number of years ago, I started thinking through again, thinking over, wondering. I honestly can't remember all the stimuli of my own shadow work, you speak of shadow work, and my background, my ancestry. I come from northeastern Tennessee, the Appalachian Mountains. And that's one way to tell if somebody's really from there or really knows or not, and that's it'll be pronounced Appalachian. And if somebody says Appalachian, then they're not talking about the Southern Appalachians. It's always Appalachia, coming at you. Anyway, those are my roots, and there's shadow there. And I was sensing that there's shadow beyond just my personal family shadow, which I had attempted to take that up, and there's real shadow there through the generations. And I was doing work on that. And so I came across a book about my area in Tennessee, and I'm not going to, this is called War at Every Door, Partisan Politics and Guerrilla Violence in East Tennessee, 1860 to 1869. Well, the man I'm named after was a boy in that very period. He was born in 1853, my great-grandfather, whose name I have. But I hadn't really realized until I read this book, this truth about my own personal background. And that is that everyone living in East Tennessee and consciously living or awake from 1860 to 1869 was affected by the Civil War. No one was unaffected. There was no neighborhood, not even in the remotest holler you could imagine, and there are some pretty remote hollers. Nobody was spared the effects of the Civil War in Eastern Tennessee. It was truly a brother against brother type situation. We could even, if we dug into it, Gary, we could look at some of the masculine psychology of the Civil War and oh my gosh. Anyway, so I read this book and that sharpened my feeling of like, I got to keep going with this. I've got to dig further. So I made my way to this book, The Baptism of Early Virginia. This is new scholarship also. All these are both scholarly books by Rebecca Ann Getz, and the subtitle is How Christianity Created Race. How Christianity Created Race. And she goes to early Virginia as an English colony and traces the very beginnings of racism in America in the Anglican Church, the Episcopal Church. The incredible book. Another scholarly book, When Slavery Was Called Freedom, Evangelicalism, Pro-Slavery, and the Causes of the Civil War. I could tell you more about that one. I got to keep going, so we'll get to our book for the evening. But then this book absolutely shook the foundations for me, by Mark Knoll, a theologian, and his title is The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Well, I hadn't gotten it. I didn't know that. I didn't understand that. I didn't even suspect that. I was clueless. I did not understand that the Civil War was a theological crisis. Well, it was. That led me to Mark Knoll's major tome, which is titled America's God. And I presented on this on 2 occasions, and you can look them up on YouTube, to the Gebser Conference, where I presented on Whirling in the Shadows of America's God. And I based that from Knoll's title, America's God. And I'm going to pull these threads together a minute. Stay with me. I know this may take a little patience. Now, my son, who teaches American history in the Seattle public school system, recommends me books, and we do a lot of consultation together, my son. And in fact, he recommended to me the next 3 books I will mention. One is this biography of Frederick Douglass, which I think, didn't you read this, Gary? I think you did.
It's me.
I did, and it really was one of the best books I've ever read. I really appreciate that.
It's 700 pages, a distinguished work by historian David Blight. I read every page, and it was. And he said, "Did you read it?" Yeah, it was. I get chills right now, even talking about it. It was a very difficult and engaging, challenging book, and it's out there now. There's a lot of vibrations with David Blight's biography of Frederick Douglass. But then I immediately went to this book by a New York Times reporter, Howard W. French, called Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. That's a pretty broad expanse. This book was extremely difficult to read. It was just so excruciatingly painful. Page after page after page. I mean, I would dread actually going on to the next pages. But this reporter, Howard French, who is African-American descent, he went to Africa. And so he's telling you a lot of these places where he has visited and says, this is how this connects to the larger story. And he does do a very adept job, in my opinion. Powerful reading, and I just went straight from Frederick Douglass to that book. Okay, so then my son recommended Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, and I hope you know his name, it's not just a challenge to racists, it's a challenge to people like me. It's a challenge to African Americans who have accepted the fact of race and define themselves by the concept of race. There's also a blurb by I'll just do the best of my language I can, a younger Black woman author, novelist, Zadie Smith. And she says, this fundamentally changed some of my oldest and laziest ideas about race. Well, I would stand behind that. My life has been changed by this book, and I will tell you in some very concise ways how it has changed. So let me do the screen share, Lisa. Okay, coming right up. And so let's see. Yeah, we'll go through this. I think we can maybe we'll be able to get through all these quotes.
Can you expand it so we don't see your desktop, so that it's easier to read?
I'll do what I can.
Can you just drag the borders of the? There you go.
Okay.
Okay, that's better.
All right. So up at the top, I feel duty bound to mention these 3 works in our, shall we say, Jungian world. And the first 2 are by Samuel Kimball's of the San Francisco Institute. He is also a Black analyst, one of the very few. And his books, which are just, again, so important, Intergenerational Complexes in Analytical Psychology, The Suffering of Ghosts, and his other book, Phantom Narratives, The Unseen Contributions of Culture to Psyche, both basically important indeed. And then Fanny Brewster, Archetypal Grief, Slavery's Legacy of Intergenerational Child Loss. A stunning book, really. And then a collection recently published, edited by Thomas Singer. All these are San Francisco centered, by the way. Cultural Complexes in the Soul of America. Myth, Psyche, and Politics. All right. Okay, ready? We'll go. Have a quick drink of water. So it's just going to be the quotes. I'll make comments briefly about the quotes, but we're not going to have time to get into discussion this evening. We can always return to this topic, probably not. I actually am not thrilled with the metaphor of racecraft as a corollary of witchcraft. And that's how they sort of structured this. And I honestly don't think it actually ultimately works the very, very best, this correlation, but it's powerfully effective no matter what its limitations are. So to begin with, racecraft occupies a middle ground between science and superstition. That's a pretty bold statement right there. An invisible realm of collective understandings. An invisible realm of collective understandings. A half-lit zone of the mind's eye. So it definitely in a psychological zone here, although this book does not really take psychological orientations very much at all, nor philosophical orientations per se. There's still more in the realm of like cultural history and anthropology, and just history. The ideas of racecraft are pieced together in the ordinary course of everyday doing. And this is where we find ourselves, if I can use that collective pronoun. Along the way, they intertwine, these ideas of racecraft intertwine with ideas that shape other aspects of American social life. Those of racecraft govern what goes with what and whom. And the word, parentheses, sumptuary codes. I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up. Sumptuary codes basically mean who can eat where, who can have a drink of water where, who can go to the bathroom where, who can buy products at certain places, and who is not allowed to buy products at certain places. Those are sumptuary codes. How different people must deal with each other, rituals of deference and dominance, where human kinship begins and ends, or blood. And that's a very tricky one as well, as they get into this. And how Americans look at themselves and each other. The gaze. This strikes very much at home for me. These ideas do not exist purely in the mind, or only in one, only one mind. They are social facts. Race, like 6 o'clock, both an idea and a reality. Because racecraft exists in this way, its constant remaking, it's continually remade, constantly retreats from view and in fact becomes more invisible. This now you see it, now you don't quality is what makes racism, the practice of a double standard based on ancestry, possible. So we're looking at a double consciousness here. That's what, and they're using that language. It's going to come up. In the teaching of American history, perhaps the most difficult lesson to convey is that slavery once held the entire country in its grip. This is becoming more widely taught and understood, is that slavery was not just a matter of south of the Mason-Dixon line, not at all. Slavery was all over America, and lots of slave trading through New York City and Baltimore. And there was also not a unilateral opposition to slavery in the North as opposed to the South. Slavery once held the entire country in its grip. It was not just the business of enslaved Black people, slaveholders, or the South. Slavery engaged an immense geography of connected activities that no American could escape, whoever they were and wherever they lived. What is more, slavery does not belong only to America's past, but is the heritage of all Americans alive today. Slavery enthroned inequality, both among free citizens and between slaves and owners, and in the manner of its ending, meaning the end of the Civil War in this case, left inequality as a permanent bequest to America's future. Now, race belongs to the same family as the evil eye. I found that was worth thinking through. The evil eye. Race belongs to the same family, but racism belongs to the same family as murder and genocide, which is to say that racism, unlike race, is not a fiction, an illusion, a superstition, or a hoax. It is a crime against humanity. So they have distinguished here between race and racism. Race is a fiction, an illusion, a superstition, and a hoax. As they illuminate, race is not an idea, but an ideology. American racial ideology is as original an invention of the founders as is the United States itself. Those holding liberty to be inalienable and holding Afro-Americans as slaves were bound to end by holding race to be a self-evident truth. Wow. That's about as concisely stated as it can be. Okay, we'll go on to the second page. And I think we will have some time to do some discussion. But let's get all the quotes out here. So let's define ideology. Ideology is best understood as the descriptive vocabulary of day-to-day existence. Our existence, through which people make rough sense of the social reality that they live and create from day to day. It is the language of consciousness that suits the particular way in which people deal with their fellows. That's ideology, the language of consciousness that suits the particular way in which people deal with their fellows. It is the interpretation in thought of the social relations through which they constantly create and recreate their collective being in all the varied forms their collective being may assume. Family, clan, tribe, nation, class, party, business enterprise, church, army, club, and so on. As such, ideologies are not delusions, but real as the social relations for which they stand. Race explained why some people could rightly be denied what others took for granted, namely liberty, supposedly a self-evident gift of nature's God. And so we're getting God concept completely in here. That's why I wanted to bring in the America's God. I mean, God concept is very much involved here. And, God concept and God image is at the core of analytical psychology and Jung's work. So race was as an ideological experience explained by some people could rightly be denied liberty, which was presented as a self-evident gift of nature's God. We have a contradiction here. Inequality was ordained by God, not by science. And, oh boy, the work is so difficult. The shadow work here is so difficult. And it was applicable not only to relations between slaveholders and slaves, but also relations between men and women, and between the planter elite and the non-slave holding majority. Inequality is woven through it, and thus our subtitle, The Soul. That's an interesting expression they chose, the soul of inequality in American life. Now, I grew up in the Jim Crow South, in northeastern Tennessee, where I'm from. Again, the story is very complicated, as I told you. Eastern Tennessee was a very complex place in the 19th century, and it was split in the Civil War. Tennessee was right in the middle. But at any rate, I grew up in a Jim Crow world. I did not know the term Jim Crow. I had never actually heard it or registered it. I felt myself to be completely innocent, when rather than innocent, I was basically ignorant. I just didn't know. Do we call that the unconscious? What do we call it? It is easier to think of the South's Jim Crow regime in its outward and visible signs, which indeed, as I learned through life, its laws, its segregated spaces, its economic arrangements, its intermittent physical atrocities, and its civic iconography. All of those apply to my hometown. Not really, so some atrocities, not in eastern Tennessee, but not far. But it can at the same time, and here's the crucial move for us, I think, in our group, our discussions, it can at the same time be mapped out as an inward and invisible topography. It has objects analogous to mountains, rivers, and the like, which must be climbed, crossed, circumambulated, avoided, or otherwise taken into account. So then we come here to the hinge point. The authors make reference to an invisible ontology. Now, I don't know if everyone on the call is familiar with that term ontology. Us philosophy majors could all give you a definition. Some may be more or less familiar with that term. I will supply it for those who might want it. Ontology is a branch of philosophy, we might say, that has to do with how do we describe the beingness of being. It's not exactly existentialism. It's more technical than that. And that is, each of us experiences, by this languaging, being. I experience that I am being. We are being together. How do we describe this beingness of this being philosophical? Well, it's a technical enterprise. But it has to do with how we experience reality. Is reality only our experience? Which moves in the direction of existentialism? Is there a reality that is the really real, that is not completely relative to individual experience or even group experience? Okay, so we're raising a lot here. They're talking about an invisible ontology, a way of discerning reality that is invisible. Racecraft is among a complex system of beliefs, also with combined moral and cognitive content, that presuppose invisible spiritual qualities underlying and continually acting upon the material realm of beings and events. In other words, there's no getting away from racecraft. It is all pervasive. The invisible aspect of race becomes apparent. This is, oh gosh. The invisible aspect of race becomes apparent as soon as we reflect that the focus of racecraft is not the outward, visible color of a person's skin, hair type, bone structure, etc., but the presumed inward, invisible content of that person's character. And that hurts. That drives it home. The invisible aspect of race is not the outward. It is the presumed inward, invisible content of that person's character. In racecraft, physical features function merely as a visible index of an invisible essence that is separate and different from the physical features. This is a major point. I mean, this is great learning for me, that racism, racecraft, the core of it is this invisible essence. In our Jungian discussions, we could take this up as an element of the unconscious, to use that language. I don't know that it's better. Invisible essence, unconscious. Racial essences belong to racecraft's invisible ontology, even though the visible manifestations of those essences are usually available to most Americans from 50 yards or more as race. Complex expression. In other words, these racial essences pervade our racecraft's invisible ontology. They are invisible, but what is visible, they say, is pretty available to most Americans within 50 yards of each other. Anytime we are within 50 yards of each other, we are aware of the visible differences that are identified as race. And of course, they are making their point that race is a fiction, but not racism. Now, they cite Du Bois. Du Bois, a great Black author, historic figure, a great influence on James Baldwin, and on and on and on. But double consciousness. So this is what, here's we get to the psychological nub here again. These authors are describing a double consciousness. And to look at it as Du Bois is looking at it, as a Black man, it's an irreducibly complex awareness of himself as his own self. And Du Bois is saying, how does he have a self-image, an unsettled and always evolving subject? It's always very highly charged. It never settles down. And at the same time, he is experiencing himself as a despised object, fixed in caricatures, braced for daily ritual insults of outsiderhood, enduring in all ways the ascriptive lot of a racial collectivity. Or as the story had it in this text, where she says, Du Bois was talking with someone, and the person asked him, he says, how does it feel to be a problem? And this was because of the common framing, the Negro problem. How is the Negro problem to be solved? We've also heard that expression with the Jewish problem, fiercely used and horrifically used. There is a Jewish problem. How is the Jewish problem to be solved? Well, there was also then this question and the expression, how is the Negro problem to be solved? Well, what does that do to a person? How does it feel to be a problem?
Well, I think women have been put into a similar category.
Very much so, very much so. Let's do the final quote, and then we can open up to discussion. To observe racecraft in action, this is their final suggestion, this is the closing sentence. Study its moves, listen to its language, and root it out. Only after doing so will we be prepared for the still harder work of tackling inequality. Inequality. How are we possibly going to work with that? So in some,
You need to stop.
I'm going to do it. In some, for me, I no longer can check off the box on any of these forms that say race. That you get it on everything. I had to do it the other day when I was registering online for my COVID-19 booster and flu shot, and I had no choice. They didn't give a box that said prefer not to answer. I will never answer again. Part of what they're saying in this, no matter what that data is about, the very term racial equality affirms the presumption of races. And they have demonstrated races don't exist. Racism exists. And race, if you want to trace it in American history, I'm showing you, in my opinion, my study, but how Christianity created race in colonial Virginia. And let me stop here because we've got time to talk. A part of the dilemma of the early Anglicans in Virginia encountering the indigenous people, and then from the bringing of blacks into America, the story is so complex, but it was, can Indians be Christians? And then there was quite a bit of trouble here. It was, well, they're definitely human beings. They are human beings, the Indians. Because since there was only one creation, since Adam and Eve are the parents of all human beings, there couldn't have been a second creation. There was only one creation. So we have encountered these human beings. Therefore, are they savable? Can they become Christians? Can they be baptized? Thus, the baptism of early Virginia. This was worked out with great complexity. And of course, it led then, as what we've already said, somehow the arrival that these human beings could be considered not really worthy of the self-evident truths of being born equal. Well, similar problems with blacks was, can they be Christians? And so it evolved that way in American history, and then we find then the Civil War as a theological crisis, basically saying, well, God has ordained slavery, and then there were enormous issues of, well, but what about breaking up slave families? Doesn't that violate religious law? Or taking babies away from mothers, which is what Fanny Brewster is tracing. Okay, so there we go. There's my report.
So it feels like you went a little too fast through the Virginia thing. So could you slow down a little bit and fill in some more details about how they got from, well, there was only one creation, they are human, but they're not as human as we are.
That's about it. The thesis of this book is that the very notion, therefore, that there are different races, and that expression, that framing, that psycholinguistic framework was developed basically to justify inequality and to say, well, they are different, they are inferior. And then there were various machinations to explain, well, how could they be inferior persons? Are they even redeemable at all? then that led even more horrifically into slavery as freedom of saying, well, the slave owner is doing a Christian duty to bring up these inferior humans who may not even capable of reading or learning religion. So the slaveholder is doing the slave a favor. The slaveholder is actually contributing to the slave's freedom by bringing them to the ways of righteousness. And there we get the self-righteousness at the core. It is still very much with us today. A self-righteousness that says, I'm better than you and God made it that way.
And the crafting, from what I'm hearing with all of this too, the crafting, race crafting was used as an instrumental to categorize the people who were non-white within that race and in the divisions in various parts of the country or wherever they were. That was their tool that they felt was given them. And they, of course, the white with their Christianity, and they think, well, of course, one creation, here they are, they're human beings, that puts them in a real dilemma. And so then they went through several different cultures and through, generations of what to do. And that's fascinating how all of these are together, and to put with what the dilemma and the racecraft, that whole word of what it's phenomenal. And to think that theology was the main, and the theology between the categories of the various regions within America with the white population of what to do, then they thought, well, we will craft it. We will institutionalize our politics, and we were going to make it. We'll decide what we're going to do.
Welcome to the year 2022. That's exactly where we are. And using the point, again, racecraft, as you summarized, as they say, the first quote, which was racecraft is between science and superstition. It's claiming a scientific basis, but it's also more like witchcraft.
Right. I listened to Tahisi and the authors speaking today, and the idea of racecraft that I got from it was that, in a sense, it's putting the cart before the horse, so that the typical case is what happened to Jewish people in Germany. So they are described as filthy and smelly, as vermin, by creating them being filthy and smelly, by depriving them of humanity. And essentially that's the same process with racecraft in America, is that you deprive them of learning, you make them as beasts of burden, and then you say, look, they are not in any way equivalent to us. So that's where I feel the witchcraft sort of came in.
It's a magic, to bring Gabser along with us. It's a magical thinking, magic. It is a blurring of categories, but then it's loaded as in the very language that says us and them, as they trace in this book by bloodline. And James Baldwin made a great deal of this. And the old law that any drop of racial blood mixture, put one in the box, in the category. So if I had one drop of black blood, then I have to and of course we know in the history with Judaism, oh my gosh, and the Jews in the Second World War, the use of these racist theories in Nazi Germany, and by the way, many of those theories were obtained from America. To again, racecraft, this magical weaving of the ontology of what is real, according to one's own power drives and power principles.
And I suppose the science is taken out of the Darwinism, in the sense that well, certainly Darwin opened up this box of animals are different, therefore, humans are different, and the eugenic movement here in America.
Very much so. Darwin is going to enter the picture, or has entered the picture here. But interesting, last week, when we had our discussion that Lisa led with concerning, what's the young man's name?
Oh, Derek Black.
Derek Black, the godson of David Duke, the formerly known as the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan.
Yes.
But all the propaganda, shall we say, of this white supremacist, and we could also say white nationalist and Christian nationalist subgroup, was based on teachings. This is the solid basis of the racial inferiority of the Black people. And it's presented in coherent texts that claim authority and say, well, this is the truth.
Right, but the data were wrong. But nobody, goes and checks the data, right?
But that was the science that did.
Well, there's the blend, as they say, the first quote here. All those quotes, I'll send you those quotes, anybody that wants them. But this peculiar blend of scientific murkiness with a magical thinking that again energizes this invisible ontology, and I confess it is true in my life. I have to work on it. This is not solved for me. I catch myself continually, and sad to say, not only with regard to African Americans and what here in California we do have a lot of diversity, but to say and even ageist. To go and say, well, somebody made a stupid turn at that intersection, and say, well, I bet that's somebody who's older than I am. And then to drive up the side and see that it's maybe a teenager.
Well, I was listening, I like Trevor Noah. So on another one of Trevor Noah's shows, he was talking about how the blood thing is the exact opposite in South Africa. That if you have even a little bit of white blood, you're considered white.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
We do have some things that are hardwired in us that are not cultural, but have become hardwired over millennia and thousands of years. And that is, we have cultures that have a problem that, from way back, worried about other cultures getting close enough to be a risk to them. And so then that's how, so they didn't, it was the other that they didn't want to have come in and bring in disease, and all of a sudden they're all dead, so they did that to protect themselves. And is race that thing that has come along from eons past that we just haven't been able to overcome yet?
Well, let's look back to, sorry, John, let me just throw this out there because I've been thinking about this and it fits with what you're saying, Garen. If we look back to, when was it, the 1600s? So about the same time, I think, as the founding of this country, in the south of Spain, you had all kinds of different religions and races and cultures, like intermixed and living, pretty peaceably. You had the Moors from Africa, you had the Jews, you had the Muslims, you had the Christians. So, it's like, why did they have to think up something different over here? You know, why couldn't that same sort of you know, live and let live attitude, what was different about their experience in this country?
It was economics in the South. It was economics. That's the slavery I've read is what caused America to be a superpower, the superpower. And without it, it would not have been, as Jefferson said, it's a necessary evil. And then in the South, Calhoun, the leader you
John
that I
C.
heard of,
Calhoun, yes.
it's not a necessary evil. It's necessary for us as white people to treat them, to nurture them. It's necessary, a good for them that they are slaves. So then it was changed.
So basically what you're saying is the theological argument was a cover for the economic argument.
Yeah.
Okay, so Doc has his hand up. Doc, do you have
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Talked to a friend today that had just returned from Greece, and he made a surprising discovery going to the history of the Agora that the democracy of ancient Greece consisted of about 10% or less of the total population, and maybe 90% were slaves. And the
well, yeah, and
institution,
also in ancient Egypt too.
oh
The
yes,
Jews were slaves
and
to the
so
Egyptians.
this is the race reasoning behind it may be uniquely American and maybe partly European, but Columbus, when first landing in America, found the natives to be so accommodating. They had a gift economy. They'd give you anything. And so his reaction was, oh, these people make natural slaves. And so this issue to me runs into, genetics and maybe skin color and whatever else is used to demarcate people. And I see it right here in Texas along the border. In order to drive these people back, you have to declare them to be in some way non-human. Now you can be aggressive toward them. If they are human, not so much. And what causes us to do that?
Utility. It's a way of being able to solve your conscience and reduce people to a certain level in your mind and then make it happen.
To use our psychological skills, tools, which we do here every week, but we could rightly speak in terms of projection. We can talk in terms of shadow. We can talk in terms of shadow projection. The transition from seeing differences among humans as differences as they have been in human experience. Of course, geography has changed. Travel has changed radically as to how the others encounter the others. But the notion that there is a universally defining structure called race, the Fields sisters are affirming there is no scientific basis for that at all. It is a creation, as you say, economic, theological, magical, and it involves shadow projection. rather than having to look at my own self and my own presuppositions about reality, I will see everything that's wrong in the other. All the troubles are over there, in that person or in that subgroup or in that race. The problem is there, and I don't have any problem I have to deal with. And this is what we talk about with analytical psychology. How does psyche, how does personality come to structure, to such structure? And sometime we're also going to have to deal with the problem of good and evil. And Jung is always going to lead us there. We're after 9 o'clock. We usually try to be righteous and have an official pause at 9 o'clock. And you don't have to go, but that's our. Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next week we will be discussing the next section of C.G. Jung on nature, technology, and modern life. That info will be sent out on email as usual. I think if you want to be on our email and you're not, you need to get in touch. Anyway, two powerful books and issues that are very much of our concern today, tonight, tomorrow.
Thanks. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. So you watched